Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Rokar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Today, I'm thrilled to have Dr. Gary Schwartz with us, who is an art historian who's based in the Netherlands, and he's joining us from there today. He is also a fellow of the Getty Center and the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies and the bearer of the Prince Bernhard Cultuurfonds Award for the Humanities. Today, he's going to talk about his most recent publication, which is a co-edited volume titled Rembrandt Seen Through Jewish Eyes, the artist's meaning to Jews from his time to ours. Dr. Schwartz, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for being with us today.
It's a pleasure, Nagar. The thanks are all mine for the opportunity to talk to your distinguished audience.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Now, the talk concerns a project on which I worked intensively for 5 years with Miriam Knotter, the chief curator of the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam, about the circumstances and destiny of the project. I will tell you in a few minutes. Well, I seem to have lost my PowerPoint.
Is that open on your desktop?
Yes.
Okay, can you click on the share button again? It should be somewhere around there.
Let's see. Share. Let me see the screen. We practiced this twice before the
Yeah, so
session was
it's gonna
open.
work.
I
It's
want you to
gonna work.
know
Don't
that.
worry. It's gonna
Okay,
work.
there we go.
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, can you give me full screen?
Can you do that? Because I can only stop sharing.
It
But
it
you can click on the TV icon
it
down
doesn't
your screen.
it doesn't open. Oh, you no.
Can you click
Okay,
on it
oh, there
again?
it
Okay,
goes.
perfect. Perfect. Wonderful.
Good. Well, over the past decades, a number of exhibitions and books have been devoted to Rembrandt, Jews, and Judaism. What distinguishes the work here presented is that it turns the vantage point around. Rather than looking at how Rembrandt envisioned Jews and Jewish matters, we've examined the way Jews look back. On the cover is Ephraim Bueno, a distinguished Jewish physician from Rembrandt's Amsterdam, and we see him actually looking at Rembrandt. This was our way of confirming the validity of the title. The main novelty in the approach concerns the significance of Rembrandt for Jewish collectors and artists, which had not been thematized before. The main outcome of the project is a book published by Amsterdam University Press, which I'll give you the information at the end of the talk. The book is divided into sections on Jews and Judaism in Rembrandt's own world, the ramifications of the relationship in society, spirituality and imagery, Jewish artists, and Jewish collectors and museums. My lecture is devoted to the subject on which I wrote a chapter, Jewish collecting Rembrandt collecting by Jews. But let me start with a sampler from the other chapters, from which I have plucked the most intriguing images, nearly all of which I'm sure will be new to you. In 1935, in his catalogue of Rembrandt paintings, Abraham Bredius illustrated a painting in Dresden of an oldish man with a beard as a portrait of a rabbi. You can see the caption. In current opinion, it is not a Rembrandt, not a portrait, and not a rabbi. But in 1960, it was still accepted as such when this photo portrait was made of the Lubavitcher rabbi, Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson. I cannot believe that the Rebbe brought a copy of Bredius to his barber, but I also can't believe that the resemblance is altogether coincidental. Rembrandt was one of the makers of a certain Jewish look. A Jewish artist who had studied with Jan Levens painted this enormous picture of Moses and Aaron for the Sephardi synagogue in London for Jews who had been driven out of the Iberian Peninsula. On the top of each screen, I have the author and title of the chapter concerned. In partnership with a group from the University of Amsterdam, Miriam Knotter filled in on a map of Rembrandt's neighborhood as much as we now know about those who lived there, especially their household goods and artworks. This is worth the price of the book on itself. Bartolet, professor of Jewish studies at the University of Amsterdam, turns his attention to the less studied Ashkenazi, Central and Eastern European Jews in the city. This print, like most, gives pride of place to the Sephardi synagogue on the left, but the Ashkenazi synagogue on the right was actually built first. Michael Sell of Boston University took a more inclusive view beyond the Sephardim and Ashkenazim, looking for the Black people in Rembrandt's art and finding materials that generally fall out of the purview of art historians. That's a little black boy, tiny figure on the right of this memento mori. Stephen Nadler, historian of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin, deepens our understanding of Rembrandt's relationship with one of the most learned and outward-looking Jews of the city, Menashe ben Israel, of whom he has published a biography in the Yale Studies Jewish Lives. Rembrandt's possible use of scholarly sources for his images of the temple in Jerusalem is studied by Shirley Perlov, retired from the University of Michigan. The former curator of the print room of the Hermitage, Roman Grigoriev, subverts the assumption that it was only in Amsterdam that Rembrandt's image of the Jew was formed when he moved to a part of the city with many Jews. He actually began using those stereotypes in Leiden, where there were no Jews. Larry Silver, retired from the University of Pennsylvania and co-author with Shirley Perloff of the book Rembrandt's Faith, takes on the rich subject of Rembrandt's meaning to Polish and Ukrainian Jews. They identified with him in their life paths as the social rebel he was taken for, as well as in his art with its images of Jews. And there's a wonderful quotation of Marc Chagall saying, "I know that Rembrandt loves me." Simon Schama, author of brilliant books on Rembrandt and of European jewelry, writes about the Jewish artists in his native Britain. Kitai's appropriation of Rembrandt ranks for me with the resemblance of the Lubavitcher Rebbe to a Rembrandt rabbi. I love this screen. With lasting sadness, I commemorate Nina Getishvili, Dean of Art History at the Russian Academy of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture, who passed away before the book was published. This picture from her expose on Russian Jewish artists exemplifies the powerful impact of Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son in the Hermitage on the Russian soul. Laurence Segal-Klagsveld was the founding director of the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme in Paris and curator of the largest and best exhibition on Rembrandt and Judaism, the catalog on the right. Taking a more positive view of mutual relations between Rembrandt and his Jewish environment than was projected in Miriam Knotter's debunking exhibition of 2006 on the left, of which I was on the advisory board, Laurence engages in polite polemics with us. Before going to the meat of my talk, let me tell you the backstory of the project. In 2012, the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center was opened in the Bakhmetevsky Garage in Moscow, a famous building of the city. This Jewish museum enjoyed wide support from the city of Moscow, the Russian President Vladimir Putin, who donated a month's salary to the construction, the Russian Jewish community and its oligarchs, as well as Chabad, the Lubavitcher movement. In addition to its permanent interactive pedagogical presentation on Jewish life, the museum also has an exhibition program at a high international level. One of its first ambitions was to mount an exhibition on Rembrandt and the Jews. In 2017, they approached Miriam Knotter, who brought me into the project. In the best possible collegial cooperation with the museum in Moscow and with Chabad in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, which was paying our invoices, Miriam and I put together an exhibition on the themes that you've just seen, with loans from all over Russia, Europe, and North America. The opening, after 2 postponements, was scheduled for October 19th, 2022. Then came February 24th, 2022, and Russia, with its attack on Ukraine, removed itself from the world cultural and museological community. Before the loan agreements could be withdrawn, the museum mailed the lenders to say that the exhibition had been delayed. I doubt that any international art exhibition can ever be held in Russia in my lifetime, but if this one can, the copy for my catalog, which I wrote while the special military operation was ongoing, is on the plank. The essays in the book were brought together in a webinar that we organized before the opening, before the planned opening, in January and February 2022. And these talks were recorded and are on YouTube. You can find them by looking on my own website, the Schwartzlist, for webinar on Rembrandt seen through Jewish eyes, and enjoy 4 sessions of 3 lectures each. The sessions are all 2.5 hours. Now, before it goes stale, let me turn to my talk on Jewish collectors of Rembrandt. Let me start by impressing on you the significance of Jewish ownership of Rembrandt paintings for the study of Rembrandt in general. Some of his most important paintings, including the 4 most expensive old masters ever sold, belong to Jewish owners. These are not only the 3 famous full-length figures from the Rothschild collection. Those are Martin Solmans and Opien Koppet, as well as the standard bearer. but also the Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer, which was the most expensive old master when it was sold in 1961. I'm leaving out of consideration the maybe Leonardo Salvator Mundi. In my research, I found 70 or so Jewish owners of work by Rembrandt. The connection between their Jewishness and their collecting habits is not always certain, and I don't want to assign motives to them they do not acknowledge, at least not much. In the published essay, I looked at all of these collectors, but in this talk, I concentrate on those for whom art collecting was clearly related to their being Jewish. I and Miriam were not particular about how often they went to shul or even whether they converted to Christianity. Neither were the environments in which they lived. Take the very first known owner of a painting by Rembrandt, Alfonso Lopez, who bought his Rembrandt directly from the artist. Lopez was a Portuguese Jew converted to Catholicism, but the sincerity of his conversion was widely doubted. He was a jeweler by trade, with something like a monopoly on diamond cutting in Paris. In a gossipy notice about Lopez, written by someone who knew him, we read the following quip. Lopez sold a crucifix for a pretty steep price. Hey, they said to him, you delivered the original so cheaply. And I would burst out laughing. My father was his neighbor. To see him eating pork just about every day, no one thought that made him a better Christian. Well, Billiam was also a figure who was caught between religions in his amazing story in the Bible. And this, I think, is what spoke to Lopez about the subject. Lopez was the first owner of a Rembrandt painting known in the 17th century, and in the 18th, that distinction falls to a Sephardi financier and banker in London named Samson Gideon. It came as a surprise to me that these two late Rembrandt portraits, which did not command proper appreciation from connoisseurs until the later 20th century, were bought by this man. I doubt, by the way, that R.B. Kitai knew that the self-portrait he mimicked had been owned by a Jew. I would have loved to have been able to tell him. Samson Gideon, with one of the largest fortunes in Britain, was the financial power behind the throne itself. In 1745, he raised £1 million to help the Hanoverian Whig government suppress a revolution by supporters of the Scottish Stuarts. That did not spare him the ignominy of being satirized for his Jewishness when, in 1753, an aborted attempt was made to pass a law allowing Jews to become naturalized British citizens. Here is a satirical print of that year, ridiculing the campaign. Gideon's hopes for recognition at the high level he felt he deserved came to naught. As Simon Schama wrote, notwithstanding its obligations to him, the quality looked at Gideon and saw the coarsely pretentious stock jobber of the exchange and passed him over. Art collecting and patronage was a way for Samson Gideon, using only the money and taste at his disposal, to match the quality on its own terms. This practice was adopted and expanded by his son, also named Samson, who was an Anglican and gained the peerage denied to his father. I'm not sure whether Samson Gideon, the son, in Rome 5 years after his father's death, did not sit for Pompeo Bartoni in the pose in which his father had been ridiculed, but I cannot resist illustrating it as a possibility. Samson Gideon has been called the Rothschild of his day, and the Rothschilds of their day, days extending from 1836 to the present, were taken as a family conglomerate the principal Jewish collectors of Rembrandt paintings. When in 1836, the London art dealer John Smith published the first catalogue of Rembrandt's paintings, he listed only one owned by a Jewish collector belonging to Baron James Mayer de Rothschild. He was the first of about 15 members of the family to own Rembrandt paintings. Concerning the question of whether the Rothschilds associated their collecting of Rembrandts with being Jewish, I consulted a present member of the family, Eric de Rothschild, who had sold those two portraits I just showed you, was kind enough to answer my direct query in this matter. Dear Mr. Schwartz, I have no recollection of any specific Jewish approach to Rembrandt in my family. The collected art was very diverse, but always trying to get the best. It was, I am sure, at that time, both between family members, but also other collectors, very competitive. And what was higher on the scale than Rembrandt? Some of the family members were more eclectic and bought, I think, up to 10 Chardins at a time when he was not a la mode. Yours sincerely, and sorry not to be of much help, E.R. Eric de Rothschild. I cannot doubt this, but even if Baron James Mayer was not thinking of a Jewish connection when he bought the Standard Bearer in 1840, it was already a prominent part of Rembrandt's image. Look only at these pages in John Smith's volume on Rembrandt of 1836. Uniquely in his catalogues of Dutch and Flemish paintings, he devotes an entire section of his indexes to Rembrandt's portraits of Jews and rabbis. The Rembrandt literature was to be endowed with another quotable quote when the German writer and political activist Edward Koloff wrote in 1854 of Rembrandt's biblical figures that they display a strong touch of the Judaic, Judelai. What may have been a relatively innocuous remark in 1856 became by 1890 an instrument of vicious anti-Semitism. Ingeniously, the perceived tie between Rembrandt and the Jews was now interpreted to the credit of Rembrandt and the vilification of Jews. Rembrandt came to stand for a model of the Nordic spirit, a true German of the blood. This notion was propagated in a tractate of unequal popularity that was first published in 1890 and was reprinted more than 100 times through the end of the Third Reich. The title itself is legendary, Rembrandt als Erzieher, Rembrandt as teacher. The author signed not with his name, which was Julius Langbein, but von einem Deutschen, by a German, claiming to represent Germanness itself. Writing about Rembrandt's relation to Jews, Langbein draws a distinction between praiseworthy Rembrandt Jews and the contemptible Jews of Langbein's own time. I quote, "In the final result, Rembrandt's nobility shows itself, weirdly enough, in his predilection for Jews, seine Vorliebe für die Juden. A genuine Jew who adheres to the old faith has something unmistakably noble about him. He belongs to the age-old moral and spiritual aristocracy from which most modern Jews have taken their leave. Rembrandt's Jews were real Jews who wanted to be nothing but Jews, which gave them character. The opposite is true of almost all Jews today who want to be German, English, French, whatever, making them characterless and nothing is worse than lack of character. It is the crime of crimes, the sin against the Holy Spirit, individualism, and unforgivable. This was the spirit of the day when, in 1897, the upper crust of Jewish Berlin banded to help found an elite civil institution, very expensive to join, the still extant and active Kaiser Friedrich Museumsverein, a society of patrons to the leading museum of northern Germany. In 2018, the Verein published a small book of capsule biographies of its Jewish members. In it, we read that at the end of the 1920s, the society had about 120 members. Of the 120, 70 were Jewish, many of them founding members from 1897 on. In a country where Jews constituted less than 1% of the population. Plainly, the Verein served as a vehicle by which wealthy Jews, without needing the approval of a sometimes hostile social milieu, could participate in the higher realms of German culture. To give you an idea of the quality level at which the members collected, with the advice of the museum director, Wilhelm von Bode, this slide of 3 Rembrandt paintings owned by 2 of the members, now proud possessions of 3 great American museums, tells enough. It also illustrates the tendency of Jewish collectors to stay away from subjects with Christian theological messages. There is one donation in particular to the Kaiser Friedrich Museum that I want to tell you about. A donation that represents an iconic moment in the theme of the exhibition and the book, and about which we have exceptionally detailed information, to which I was guided by Katja Kleinert, the curator of Dutch and Flemish paintings in the Gemälde Gallery in Berlin. In the 1890s, a major Jewish art collector, Rodolphe Kahn, a German-born Frenchman, bought this head of Christ in Paris. After Kahn's death, his entire collection was bought in 1907 for $4.5 million by one of the leading galleries in Old Masters, Duveen Brothers, a Jewish firm. This was front-page news all over the world. His Head of a Young Jew, now in the Kimball Art Museum, I have no hesitation in calling the most moving image of a Jew Rembrandt ever made. The young Fritz Schmidt-Stegener, future director of the Rijksmuseum, visited the Rodolphe Kahn collection after his death and saw this young Jew featured in the center of a big wall of Dutch paintings. He wrote in a review, "Did these collectors, that is Rodolphe and his brother Maurice, realize what an honorable distinction it is for the Jewish race to be represented by this exquisite, noble character? I have no doubt that they did." From Duveen, the Head of Christ was bought for £2,000 sterling by the Hamburg entrepreneur Martin Bromberg and his wife Eleanor, or Laura. Laura was the sister of the deceased Rodolphe Kahn, so the couple knew very well what they were buying. They bought it, however, not for themselves. The painting never went to Hamburg. On December 7th, 1907, the Brombergs signed a paper by which they donated it to the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in Berlin. On December 21st, 1907, it was sent by train from Paris to Berlin, where on February 6, 1908, it was inscribed in the museum books at an evaluation of 20,500 marks. In the museum, the painting took its place in a corner of one of the Dutch galleries, which we see here in a photo taken in 1917. This display is a veritable paean to Jewish subject matter, Jewish patronage, and Jewish collecting. The two large paintings show the virtuous and clever young biblical heroes Daniel and Joseph, both of whom rise to high court positions in foreign countries without abandoning their religion. It was happenstance that they were in the collection, but their placing calls attention to the success of smart Jews in mighty kingdoms, Daniel in Cyrus's Persia, Joseph in the Egypt of the pharaohs, with overtones of the Jewish grandees in the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm. Two of the smaller paintings show a young and an old man, both seen as Jews. The old man as the patriarch Jacob. Sorry about the this down here. Oh, I also have disappeared out of. Oh, I'm not going to fiddle with this. It'll go bad if I try. Jewish patronage is exemplified by the man with the golden helmet in the upper left and the portrait of a young Jew in the lower tier. These were two of the very first paintings acquired by the Kaiser Friedrich Museumsverein, the young Jew in 1896 and the man with the golden helmet in 1897. They are still property of the Verein on permanent loan to the museum. Jewish collecting would have been apparent to anyone in the know. Christ and the woman of Samaria on the lower left, and the head of Christ were from the collection of Rodolphe Kahn, the latter as a donation of the Brombergs. Both came in on the same train from Paris. Although Martin Bromberg was not a member of the Verein, he too consulted Bode on his purchases. The Bromberg donation embodied an implicit, mutually beneficial link between the upper reaches of German culture and Jewish philanthropy, with Rembrandt and Jesus serving as interdenominational tokens of the bond. Rembrandt and Jesus. Jewish patronage was not an effective antidote to anti-Semitism. While Wilhelm von Bode and his museum were benefiting vastly from Jewish gifts, he also devoted a long, critical, but appreciative review to Langbane's book, Rembrandt als Erzieher, in a prestigious journal, without referring to the author's anti-Semitism. There is an undocumented but persistent rumor that Bode introduced Langbane to Chancellor Bismarck, who was Langbane's foremost idol of present-day Germanness, as Rembrandt was the greatest German of past times. Speaking of which, I cannot withhold from you this funny comparison. My dear departed colleague Martin Warnke suggested that Bode's eagerness to let Berlin Jews pay for the man with the golden helmet was not unrelated to its resemblance to the Iron Chancellor himself. Bode was playing on everyone's feelings while making himself indispensable to all. Following the Shoah, it is easy to forget that European anti-Semitism was more rampant and more socially discriminating in France than in Germany, and that it spread more virulently into judgments concerning art and collectors. Preceding the Dreyfus affair, but preparing the ground for it, was an extraordinary, highly acclaimed, and phenomenally successful book of 1886, La France Juive by Edouard Drumont. The aim of this two-volume, 1,200-page tome was to make France great again. by excising the dire, all-pervasive Jewish influence that had poisoned the blood of the pure French race. This had to do with aesthetics, as well as everything else. Semites lack the power of creation, Drummond wrote. They subsist by exploiting the inventions of the Aryans. In Drummond's dream of a France rid of Jews, Rembrandt has his part to play. Quote, "It's Rembrandt, and one must, I would not say look at, but contemplate, study, scrutinize, search, analyze, if we really want to see the Jew." Rembrandt was always living with Israel. His studio itself resembled those shops of second-hand goods in the back of which the disoriented eye finally catches sight of a sordid old man with a hooked nose. His work has a Jewish color. It is yellow, in that intense, warm yellow that seems like the reflection of gold playing on an old yellow badge from the Middle Ages, forgotten in a corner. In such a toxic environment, we cannot but take special notice of the burst of collecting activity in this period among wealthy French Jews. Between 1883 and 1908, the catalogued ownership of Rembrandt paintings in this group rose from 10 paintings owned by 6 collectors to 34 owned by 13. In an article that I wrote about this phenomenon in the Festschrift for Petra Chut and Duschate, I called them the Dreyfus Rembrandts. In the same year as the Kaiser Friedrich Museumsverein was founded, a parallel effort was undertaken in Paris with the establishment of the Société des Amis du Louvre. This body is framed differently than the Verein, more popular than elite. In the late 1920s, it numbered nearly 3,000 members. Were the Société to publish a book on its Jewish members, they would surely not have been in the majority. But their impact would be highly visible. In 1913, the chairmanship was offered to Isaac de Camondo of the Camondo-Efrussi clan made famous by Edmund de Waal. Camondo, who had made a donation of 808 works to the Louvre, turned the honor down because it was accompanied by an anti-Semitic slur. In a recent book by James Macaulay, The House of Fragile Things, Jewish Art Collectors and the Fall of France, the author's analysis of the situation of French Jewish collectors is trenchant and very much to the point. There may not have been anything significantly Jewish about the art and the collections they amassed, but the donations they made and the museums they left behind were subtle attempts to respond to the anti-Semitism of the fin de siècle, to show that Jews could indeed curate a genuine, authentic image of France and shape its national patrimony. The bequests these collectors made also became political statements, arguments in favor of the eternal compatibility of Frenchness and Jewishness. Also not a great help. Jews who thought that their collecting was winning them approval from all French art lovers were deceiving themselves. After the death of Rodolphe Kahn's brother Maurice, when in 1909 his collection was put up for auction, it was commented on by a prominent French art historian, Louis Dimier. He wrote an article in the right-wing anti-Semitic journal L'Action Française with the title Les collections juives. Taste in art is fundamentally foreign to these collections. In the Jewish collection, and I'm talking about the best ones, there is in general nothing more than a need for dealing, some mercantile savoir-faire, knowledge of superficialities. That's all there is. That's all. As for those who buy a Rembrandt, there is as for those who buy a Rembrandt, They think of themselves as performing a great deed. They appear to themselves as serious people, protectors of the arts, even thinkers and philosophers. Rembrandt is admirable, and there's enough taste in the world to preserve him for sincere art lovers, but I assure you that they are not the ones buying Kahn's Rembrandts. These were picked up in the flea market and are being sold to snobs. Jewish collecting of Rembrandt, in sum, cannot be seen merely or mainly as an exercise of taste. The collectors knew that they were entering into a high-stakes game of art marketing and social, religious, and ethnic contention, as well as history and connoisseurship. A game in which they looked like expert players to some and cheaters to others. In Germany and France, where this collecting largely took place, only the Rothschilds can be said to have won the game. The rest of the collectors who figure in this story are American. In America, as in Europe, art collecting afforded a means to generate a social distinction that one had in one's own hands. The immediate buyer of the Maurice Kahn collection was once more Duveen Brothers for $3 million. Among the American millionaires who were their clients was the New York department store owner Benjamin Altman, the foremost Jewish American collector of his time. Upon his death in 1913, Altman bequeathed 13 Rembrandts to the Metropolitan Museum of Art as part of the largest single donation ever received by the museum. Illustrated are 10 of the paintings in the bequest. While most of these are no longer accepted as by Rembrandt, that does not diminish the significance of the bequest in its time. A man, by all accounts, a self-effacing man, who would not have been admitted to a men's club or athletic society in New York, was able to put his name on a gallery in the city's foremost museum. Art collecting by wealthy businessmen tends to be contagious. The Rothschilds inspired imitative behavior by some of those who worked for them in banking and finance, like Jules Porges. Another nexus of the kind were the mainly British dealers in diamonds and gold, like the Beitz and Max Michaelis. Benjamin Altman, too, inspired his successor at B. Altman and Company to collect art. For Michael Friedsam, art collecting fit into larger moral and even spiritual values. He bequeathed his fortune and estate, which included one Rembrandt workshop painting, mainly to educational institutions, notably the Franciscan St. Bonaventure University. This compliment to Christianity by a Jew, like that of Martin Bromberg, was intended to foster goodwill that was not always reciprocated. At St. Bonaventure it was. And I'm happy to say that in America, the position of Jewish collectors and donors was accepted gladly and did gain them social esteem in contrast to Germany and France. Although no private collectors after the Second World War were able to acquire Rembrandt paintings of the quality and importance of those that were inherited by the Rothschilds from their 19th century forebears, it's striking, in the context of Rembrandt seen through Jewish eyes, that so many of the most dedicated collectors of Rembrandt and Rembrandt school paintings and drawings of the post-war period were Jewish. Only bit by bit were they able to collect on terms that were not a response to anti-Semitism. In a class of his own is the late Alfred Bader. To this chemist, inventor, businessman, philanthropist, volunteer teacher at a Jewish Sunday school, art collector, art dealer, donor of art, and sponsor and supporter of art history, to this man, being Jewish and collecting Rembrandt, were guiding passions. He puts it into as many words in one of his memoirs, Adventures of a Chemist Collector. In this passage, he writes that his desire to own a particular Rembrandt Trony, face painting, of a Jew was sparked by a lecture of Jacob Rosenberg's at Harvard in the 1940s, in which Rosenberg spoke of that painting as an example of Rembrandt's sympathy with the Jews. Let me show you the Tronies that Rosenberg published as such in his book on Rembrandt of 1948. Here in the second edition of 1973, in which the illustrations are integrated with the text. The painting to which Bader was referring is the one on the right, from the Erickson collection. But the other one, then in a private collection in France, is another of Rosenberg's examples, of which he wrote that they embody, quote, patriarchal dignity, while expressing a stubborn tenacity of character, along with an intellectual gift for casuistic argumentation. Bader might have recognized himself, too, in this characterization. And now let me show you two of Bader's later acquisitions. What makes this example exceptional are only two things: that the collector embraced Jewishness publicly and prominently, and that he put into words Rembrandt's attraction to him for the artist's sympathy for Jews, not only in this book, but in a lecture that he delivered widely. As I see it, the attraction is there for most or all Jewish collectors of Rembrandt, even if it is not made explicit or foremost in their minds. These two became the object of donations. Bader, his wonderful widow, and children donated Rembrandt paintings to the Agnes Etherington Art Center in Kingston, Ontario, to which Bader was admitted as a refugee from Austria in the 1940s, when other universities in North America would not accept him due to their Jewish quotas. I met Jacob Rosenberg once, around 1977. He came to talk to me about the new edition of the book on Lucas Cranach that he had written in 1932 with Max Friedlander, in the preparation of which I was involved as a publisher. Allow me to stand still here for a moment. In 1932, only weeks before the initiation of the Third Reich, the director of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, Max Friedlander, and the head of the Department of Prints and Drawings, Jacob Rosenberg, were both Jewish. This situation was unthinkable anywhere else in the world, certainly not in the United States. This only adds to the unimaginable bitterness of what was to follow in that country of all countries. The subject of the collaboration of Friedlander and Rosenberg augments the pain. The artist to whom they dedicated a monograph that has never been replaced, Lucas Cranach, was the most German of artists, the artistic partner of Luther himself. The Luther monograph of 1932 reverberates to much the same notes as Martin Bromberg's donation of a Rembrandt head of Christ to their museum. Rosenberg was brought to my house by another Jewish Rembrandt collector who, like Alfred Bader, was inspired by Rosenberg's scholarship and humaneness, and who also is a supporter of art history and curatorship, as well as a major donor of art to museums. That is George Abrams. I show him in this beautiful photo of him with his beloved wife, Maida, who died in 2002 at a sadly young age, and whose name is forever linked with his in the collection that is always called the Maida and George Abrams collection. Asked directly, as I did, whether the fact of his being Jewish has anything to do with his collecting, George denies it and I have to believe him. He is an exemplar of the Rembrandt collector who just happens to be Jewish, but who I think nonetheless has warm feelings for Rembrandt for that reason. For the exhibition, he agreed to lend a lovely portrait that might well be by Rembrandt and may well be of a Jewish woman. The final Jewish collectors to which I wish to draw your attention merit special interest. Thomas Kaplan and his wife Daphne Recanati Kaplan have brought together over the past 20 years a sizable collection of museum-quality Dutch paintings of the 17th century, including more Rembrandts than any now owned by a single private collector. The Kaplans have made the collection available for display worldwide. I have seen outstanding exhibitions of their Dow paintings in the Lachenhal Museum in Leiden in 2014 and in 2017 of 31 Dutch paintings in the Louvre. From there, the Louvre exhibition went on to Russia in the Hermitage and the Pushkin Museum, to China in Shanghai and Beijing, and to the Louvre Abu Dhabi. For the Kaplans, the Leiden collection, as they call it, complements a range of philanthropic activities in wildlife and culture. This adds conviction to Tom's statements about the spiritual dimension of his enterprise, with roots in Kabbalah. In closing, let me quote the most pertinent statement by a Jewish collector of how he sees Rembrandt. In a speech at the opening ceremony of the exhibition of the Leiden collection in the Louvre, Tom Kaplan said, "While art that touches the soul may not alone be able to save the world, perhaps Rembrandt has a tangible role to play in what the Jews call tikkun olam, repairing the world. Daphne and I will happily take that as a first step. May there be many more to follow."
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk, Dr. Schwartz. We do have a couple of minutes, maybe 7 minutes, for a Q&A. So I would like to invite our audience to write their questions in the Q&A box so I can read them to you. But I would like to start with my own questions until our audience can take this time to write their questions, if you don't mind.
Sure, please.
Yeah, thank you. So it was very interesting to learn about these kinds of donations to national museums, donations of Rembrandt's works by Jewish collectors to national museums. In what ways do you think these works played a role in shaping that national identity that a museum represents?
I think they played a considerable role. They were aiming at placing Rembrandt. There was a kind of product placement even in those donations. And there was no quid pro quo involved. They were doing it demonstratively selflessly, you could say. And this did make an impression. Of course, it did not convince anyone who was an anti-Semite and looked down on them to change his mind about it, but to other people in society and in the long run, it mattered. One Rothschild collector that I didn't mention in the talk, Edmond de Rothschild, made the largest donation of prints to the Louvre that has ever been made, with a nearly complete collection of Rembrandt etchings, and his collection is a kind of touchstone for the study of Rembrandt etchings. So you find yourself going to these collections, which some of the Jews insisted on being labeled with their names. That is another indication of their intentions, as Altman, Benjamin Altman did, and Edmund de Rothschild. So these are significant ties.
Right. Do you think that these collecting patterns changed over time from 17th century to particularly late 19th century with World War One. I know you addressed it a little bit in your talk, but can you elaborate a little bit on this kind of collecting patterns over time?
Well, yes, in each generation it was different depending on the circumstances of a man like Alphonse Lopez and running the diamond business in Paris, to Otto Beit running the diamond business for the world with his mines in South Africa. And there, of course, there was a lot of just interest and delight in the art of Rembrandt. They weren't collecting just to be propagandistic influencers of the Jewish of the appreciation of Judaism. Of course, these people were also art lovers. So the only kind of general claims I make concern with the Dreyfus Rembrandts, that immense leap from 10 to 35 paintings exactly in the years between 1885 with La Juive, La France Juive, and the First World War. That I think is significant in itself. You know, as I called it in the subtitle of my article in that Festschrift, there's no smoking gun. But everyone's going to come to agree with me in the long run.
Thank you. We do have a comment in the Q&A by Polly. Thank you, Mr. Schwartz, for your explicit and lovely lecture. I'm grateful to the Jewish collectors for bequeathing all these glorious paintings so I and all the rest of the world can enjoy them. We do have another comment by Edward. Many thanks for the fascinating talk. I second both these comments. Interested to hear Simon Schama wrote on curators in your volume. I like the reference, but I also wonder if Aby Warburg features in your account. He was encouraged to interested himself in Rembrandt by Fritz, who brought the Warburg Institute to London, where the huge copy of Rembrandt's Oath of the Batavians still hangs.
Well, he's included heavily in the exhibition. I wrote him up in the catalog of the exhibition, and I think in the book as well. I was very interested, of course, in Jewish art historians and their interest in Rembrandt, and I include Simon Schama and myself in that row. But Aby Warburg actually also did not feature himself as Jewish, but I quote his Namazani project, in which in 8 or 10 of the frames on which he pinned up reproductions of works about there were works by Rembrandt, which he brings into play in all sorts of extremely meaningful ways. So the question, or I can answer saying that we have paid attention to Warburg and would have liked to done more.
Right, thank you. We are running out of time. We only have 1 more minute. So in the last minute, I would like to ask you about the Schwartzlist that I know you are the organizer. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yes, I'm sorry, I should have put up the URL on the board, but Gary Schwartz Art Historian.nl from Netherlands with Gary Schwartz Art Historian without any dots. I've been writing a blog since 1996, making me one of the pioneers of art historical blog writing. And I've put quite a lot of these up on internet now. So you can go to Schwartzlist, as I call it now, or Gary Schwartz Art Historian.nl. Take out a subscription by all means, and you'll be getting, not too frequently, but often enough, I hope, my wisdom on your screen.
Thank you very much. We will benefit from your scholarship. Thank you again for being with us. I do have a few announcements. I have included them in the chat during the talk, but the Art of Negozio is presenting a 4th roundtable tomorrow, Wednesday the 27th at 3 p.m. New York time. This is going to be on Zoom, and if you would like to join the session, please go to our website homepage, and then you will see the thumbnail, and you can click on that and join the Zoom meeting. Next week, the talk is not going to be live. Unfortunately, there has been a conflict of schedule for the speaker, so we decided to record the talk on Monday, and then I will publish it at the same time on Tuesday, 5 p.m. New York time on Tuesday, but we won't have a live Q&A. However, I will provide the email address of the speaker, so you can, if there are any follow-up questions, you can reach out them directly. At the end, I would like to wish everyone all of those of you who are celebrating Thanksgiving this Thursday, if you're in the US, I would like to wish you a meaningful and joyful and full of connections and reflections and Thanksgiving. I'm also grateful to the Medici Archive Project for this opportunity to organize and host the MAP Forum. Thank you so much again for being with us. See you all next week, same time, same link, it works for every week. Thank you again, Dr. Schwartz, for being with us tonight, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, a pleasure.
Thank you, bye-bye, bye.